My name is Victor Fuhrman. Some call me the Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. Genesis 1:26 says in the English translation, "And God said, Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." In this reference, the Hebrew word for God is Elohim. The problem this presents is that Elohim is actually plural for the word El, and the words us and our also imply two or more. If there is only one God, why is the name plural, and why do the pronouns suggest two or more? Some have said this reflects the Christian concept of the Trinity, but with a monotheistic foundation, this predates it. Others have conjectured that the reference includes the feminine divine, but again, this would be contrary to the foundation. The question then arises, who were the Elohim that created humanity in their image? My guest this week on Destination Unlimited, Paul Anthony Wallace, says the answer may well be extraterrestrial. Paul Anthony Wallace is a popular speaker, researcher, and author of books on spirituality and mysticism. Today, his work probes world mythology and ancestral narratives for their insight into human origins and human potential. He is currently the go-to guy on the UFO and alien phenomena, with much of his current research now focused on alien contact and how it plays a part in our history and mythology. He lives in Canberra, Australia. His website is paulanthonywallace.com, and he joins me to discuss his latest book, Escaping from Eden, Does Genesis Teach That the Human Race Was Created by God or Engineered by ETs? Please join me in welcoming to Destination Unlimited, Paul Anthony Wallace. Welcome, Paul.
Good day, Victor. Thank you so much for having me on your show today.
Good day to you, and thank you for joining us. And I love the fact that I had the chance to say good day to someone down in Australia, down under. So that was very nice. Thank you.
Glad to provide the opportunity.
Thank you so much. When we welcome a guest to Destination Unlimited for the first time, we ask them to share their path and how it led to the work that they do. Please share your story and how it shaped your life and interest in UFOs and extraterrestrials.
Sure. Well, I think I'll begin when I was 11 years old, and I was given the special treat of attending one of my mum and dad's grown-up dinner parties. And it was a special treat. They would pull out all the stops with the food, and my brother and I were there trying to keep up with the grown-up conversation. And in that context, I was introduced to the work of Erich von Däniken. His classic book, Chariots of the Gods, was charting at the time. I think it had been out for about 10 years by that point, but it was very much still in public discussion. And my ears pricked up because I felt in what I was hearing that Erich von Däniken had correctly identified a gap in our ability to explain ourselves as a conscious, intelligent, technological species on planet Earth. The religious answers I was hearing at the school I was attending didn't seem to be able to explain why it's so obvious that we're animals if we're some kind of a unique special creation. And then scientific answers didn't seem to explain the fact that we're at the top of the tree is only because we've got this aspect of intelligence and consciousness that we can't really explain where that came from. So I felt that a gap had been named and a taboo had been broken, and that really fascinated me. And in a funny way, it led me into the world of Christian ministry because it prompted me to ask some ultimate answers about where everything came from. And I had some Christian friends who introduced me to the teachings of Jesus. And once I'd worked out there was a difference between the credibility of Jesus and the credibility of religious institutions, I thought, well, this Jesus is someone I'm interested in following. So I followed him into the world of ministry, and for 33 years was a church doctor, a theological educator, archdeacon for the Anglican Church. But in all that time, I felt there were some questions that Erich von Däniken had raised that remained unresolved. The question of, are we living in a populated universe? And if so, what's our relationship with our neighbors? It was always just simmering there in the back of my mind. And then about 10 years ago, there was a moment that was quite significant, which I think we'll touch on later, when the Roman Catholic Church convened a colloquium, a symposium, to discuss the theological implications of contact with another civilization. That was the phrase. Not moss on a moon of Mars, but another civilization. And one of the spokespeople for the Vatican at that time, Guy Consolmagno, who's a senior astronomer for the Vatican Observatory, really laid down a gauntlet. He said that believers shouldn't be surprised to encounter extraterrestrial beings, should be ready to embrace them as brothers and sisters, shouldn't be surprised, he said, because they're in the Bible from start to finish. And when he said that, I thought, really? Could I have missed something as glaring as aliens in the Bible? Because I'd been teaching pastors for 15 years how to interpret these ancient texts. Could I have missed extraterrestrials from start to finish? And that was really the challenge that they threw down. And I thought, when I get the time, I'm going to drill down into that. And so I did. The final prompt to get me to sit down and do this work was actually a preaching series I did through the book of Genesis. And like any parent who's ever sat down with a children's Bible and a child, was confronted once again with some really obvious questions. And you mentioned one of them at the top of the program. Let us make the humans to look like one of us. Well, one of who? And then you get to Genesis 3, and you've got the death penalty for eating an apple. That doesn't make sense. And then Genesis 6, you've got a loving God genociding. I mean, that's the worst crime we can conceive of, genocide. How do you explain to a child that a loving God would do that? Get to Genesis 11, and you've got the human race bombed back into an animal state because they built a building that's too tall. Well, if a child asks you to explain that, you're likely to have to end up saying, I'm going to have to think about that. And so finally I did think about it and went back and did some translation work that just unlocked those stories and showed that there's a whole other layer to those stories that is not about what we think it is. And that's what brought me onto this territory of ET contact.
And we're going to go a little deeper into that a little later in the interview, but I wanted to touch upon a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned the Vatican's position. Why do you think the Vatican came out with that? What do you think their motivation was?
Oh, it's so intriguing. It really took me by surprise because it was such a turnaround. I mean, it was only 400 years ago the same institution was burning people at the stake for just suggesting there might be intelligent life on other planets. And now all of a sudden, all believers should be considering it, apparently. It was curious because it gave the appearance that they were expecting a disclosure to be made and wanted to get in first to prepare the faithful. And so they had various spokespeople come out and say, there's no theological issue. It just gives us a bigger universe we're part of, a bigger cosmic family we're part of, a bigger vision of God. And they prepared us for about a year before the symposium actually happened. They told us what it was all about. And then these wonderful people, Guy Consolmagno, Monsignor Corrado Balducci, the senior officer for paranormal ministry for the Vatican, and then the director of the Vatican Observatory, Father Gabriel Funes, they were all coming and saying the same thing. We need to be ready. And this phrase kept being used, sooner than anyone anticipates, to embrace a brother or sister alien. And that sense of urgency made me think they are concerned someone else is going to make a disclosure, and they want to prepare the faithful so they can say, don't you remember we talked about this? There's no issue. But then no big disclosure came. We've had some interesting drips since of disclosure, but nothing big happened at that time that I thought might have happened because there was such a sense of urgency to what they did. Under the most conservative Pope in my lifetime, Pope Benedict XVI. So that made me wonder.
And something else was said in the context of that, and that's that the extraterrestrials need not be under Jesus.
Well, there were some really interesting questions asked that I think Guy Consolmagno addressed as well. And he talked about being willing to baptize ETs. And some people had a laugh at the idea that people might travel light years just to join the Roman Catholic Church. But it was an amusing way of tackling the question of what does this do to our story of God and our story of salvation? How much do we have to review in the light of realizing we're in a populated universe?
Absolutely. Now, before we go into the book, let's touch upon a couple of other aspects of your career. Your bio describes you as a barefoot walker and a conscious breather. Most of our listeners are aware of conscious and mindful breathing, but what is a barefoot walker?
Well, barefoot walking is something a lot of people just do by preference or by instinct. I noticed that many of the great saints that I've admired through the centuries in Christian story were barefoot walkers, but I've discovered there's a bit of science behind it, and it's to do with something called earthing. Now, any electrical device in your home that uses alternating current, you will want to earth to keep it healthy and safe, keep you safe when you're using it. Well, our bodies are electronic devices as well. Our bodies use electricity, our brains use electricity, and our bodies generate an electromagnetic field. So when you earth your body, you're connecting your EMF to the planet's EMF. And I had to start thinking my way through what all this meant when I started sleeping on an earthing mat, and it fixed my sleep apnea. I had no expectation that was going to happen. My wife made me do it. I was diagnosed with sleep apnea, and I was going to give a CPAP machine a second go. They're really difficult to get used to. And my wife really hated it because it looks like a life support machine. It's very confronting. And she said, well, would you try an earthing mat first before we spend all that money? Just see if this will help. So because Ruth asked me, I said, yes, of course I will. So we put an earthing mat on our bed, which simply connects you with the earth, with the ground. You can do it by plugging it into the soil or plugging it into the earthing circuit in your home. And from that night on, I haven't once woken up coughing and spluttering as I had done for the 5 years previously. And so when it worked, I had to think, well, how did it work? And I realized it has to do with the fact that our bodies use their electromagnetic fields to keep us healthy, for functioning, and as communication loops. And that was clearly what was fixed. The communication loop between my brain and the back of my throat was fixed as soon as I regularized my electromagnetic field. Barefoot walking is a very simple way you can do it. And now I look back and realize that it was following that period where I really focused on earthing that there was a sudden, rapid download for me in terms of fresh thinking and fresh perspectives that led me to do the reframing that produced Escaping from Eden.
You also practice Christian healing. What's that?
Well, that's a great question. These days, I think I would just say I'm a healing practitioner because I was introduced to modalities of healing as a Christian. I became a Christian when I was 17 years old, and it was in the context of an amazing renewal that was happening in the churches where people were having powerful spiritual experiences. And this included physical and emotional healing that you could find no explanation for other than that we were tapping some kind of power. And then through the years, I noticed that the things we were doing in our churches, our healing practices, were really indistinguishable from things I was finding people doing who were not Christians, who might have no religious affiliation, but they'd found that doing similar things that we were doing were having healing outcomes for people. And so that began breaking open the boxes of my Christianity a little bit and realizing that we live in an amazing universe, that we all have potentially access, contact, an ability to connect with kind of source principles, source energies, things that are properties of the universe, and that sometimes we can do that in a way that affects healing. So in the church was where I learned how to lay hands on people, pray for people, speak to conditions, and see changes. And now I realize I'm part of a much bigger community of people doing that all around the world, using practices that are ages old.
Your extended bio also says that in the 1980s and 90s, your work centered on establishing foundations for new faith communities, and that during the last 20 years, you designed and delivered training for church ministers in the United Kingdom and Australia. You're also, as you had mentioned, Archdeacon in the Australian Anglican Church. How does your faith-based community regard your research into UFOs and ETs, and wouldn't these two paths be mutually exclusive?
Well, yes, a lot of people would think they're exclusive, but part of the purpose of Escaping from Eden is to show that if you go to the Bible, you're looking at a book that has curated stories about ET contact. But in terms of people's reaction, yes, there are some who are a bit shocked by what I'm writing about, and I do have some Christian friends who are keeping a little bit more distance from me than usual because they're just they haven't processed what I'm writing about. But in actual fact, talk about a wider cosmic family, ET contact, abduction experiences, close encounters, they were part of the mainstream Christian conversation right at the beginning of Christian history, and it was only later that it became a bit of a taboo. I wrote this book in the luxurious position of not needing to apply for a ministry position, and I think it would be interesting to see what would happen if I was applying to lead a congregation, because this kind of conversation can be difficult for people. And you might find a whole chunk of your congregation over here who say, oh, isn't it wonderful we're exploring these ideas? I've had these experiences, I've had these thoughts. And then others in the congregation thinking, pastor's a heretic. So I'm in the luxurious position of not leading a congregation at the moment, and that gives me the liberty to press into more controversial territory. And as I do, I find I'm contacted by a lot of people who are many people with no religious background, but a lot of people who are ministry people, who are pastors, who are denominational leaders, and a lot of them are saying to me, I'm so relieved to hear this topic being talked about from this perspective and to hear a pastor willing to engage with this. And this will be either because they've had experiences or because they've seen the same anomalies in the scriptures that I've had, or because they're pastoring people who've had close encounters and they need to develop a pastoral response. And breaking the taboo around these topics is absolutely vital if we're to be able to do those things and have those conversations and know how to talk to each other about what we've been experiencing.
How would you answer those in the church community that would say that the ET experience is something less than blissful, perhaps demonic in nature?
Well, there are two reasons people might say it's demonic in nature, and one would be because they've had a really harrowing experience. Now, not all close encounters are harrowing experiences. A lot of people have interactions that seem to be very benevolent. Some people have told me they've experienced healing of various kinds through ET contact. But I think a lot of us have grown up with a worldview where reality falls into a number of boxes. There's God, the devil, angels, demons, humans, animal, vegetable, mineral, and nothing else. And so if you have a harrowing experience that appears to be supernatural in the sense that you can't explain it, well, what box are you going to put that in? You're going to have to put it into the devil or demonic box. But as soon as you actually go back to the text, do the translation work, you realize there are a whole load of other kinds of entities in this great universe of ours that are none of those things, that are neighbors, that are other kinds of entities, energy-based beings, extraterrestrial beings, interdimensional beings. And the picture is really much wider than we've generally allowed it to be.
My guest is Paul Anthony Wallace. He's the author of Escaping from Eden, which we'll be talking about more of in the next segment. Paul, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you and your work.
Sure. If you go to my website, paulanthonywallace.com, that's Anthony with an H, Wallis, Wallis, paulanthonywallace.com. You can follow everything I'm doing there. You can get Escaping from Eden from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kindle, wherever books are sold. If you go to the Paul Wallace channel on YouTube or the Fifth Kind TV, you can keep up with documentaries that we're putting out there as well.
And we'll be back with more of Paul Wallace and Escaping from Eden after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers, pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Hi, we're the Goo Goo Dolls. We're fortunate that we can give our daughters everything they need to grow and learn. But not every child can focus on classes and play dates.
Nearly 13 million kids in the U.S. face hunger. That's 1 in 6. School lunch might be their only meal each day, and it's heartbreaking to imagine any child going to bed hungry. We're dreaming of a perfect day when kids can smile, play, and just be kids without worrying about where their next meal will come from. Feeding America is working to make that perfect day a reality.
Each year, the Feeding America network of food banks rescues billions of pounds of good food that would have gone to waste. That food is given to families and children in need. Being a kid should be about doing things that make an ordinary day extraordinary. Learning to play an instrument, building a sandcastle, hosting tea parties. Hunger should never be an obstacle to growing up.
You can help end childhood hunger in your community by visiting feedingamerica.org.
Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
Hi, this is David Strickle. I'm excited to share my brand new show, The Stream of David Live, right here on OMTimes Radio. Each week I'll have exciting guests and I'll channel the eternal wisdom of the stream, a group of non-physical entities whose teachings have transformed lives all over the world. So join us for an uplifting hour each Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. That's The Stream of David Live right here on OMTimes Radio.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Paul Anthony Wallace. He's the author of the book, Escaping from Eden. So, Paul, in the first segment, we touched a little bit about the book. Let's talk about the foundation work of the book. You started looking through Genesis and started finding all of these inconsistencies and questions. What other ones did you find besides the plural name for God, Elohim?
Well, besides the plural word, there are these storylines that are rather intriguing that refer to a body called the Heavenly Council. And I was intrigued by this, and I went to some Jewish chronicles and commentaries to explain this phenomenon, and I realized this was a rabbit hole, because the Heavenly Council is not like God plus his avatars. it appears to be a community of beings who are somewhat in conflict with one another over the management of Project Humanity. And it's another storyline that begins opening up this picture of a cabal of ET visitors who have come to colonize planet Earth. So if you want another way into the story, then look up all the texts on the Sky Council or the Heavenly Council. But what I found, that the real red pill for me was when I sat down and asked myself, what happens if I reread the Elohim stories with Elohim in the plural? Because it is a masculine plural form word. It does a lot of the time take plural form verbs and attributives, exhibit plural behaviors, conflicts, has arguments. What if I just take that it is a plural and read it that way? The stories change, but they don't change in a random way. What changes is that they do a flip and they suddenly line up with the Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, and Assyrian stories that we now believe are the source narratives of those Genesis stories. And what's so interesting about that, when you go to the Sumerian originals and you find their version of the creation, Adam and Eve, the fall, the flood, the limiting of human life, the Tower of Babel, the original stories are not God's stories. The original stories are about sky people who have come from another planet to planet Earth, have modified our primate ancestors to create us, Homo sapiens, and are now governing Project Earth. Those are the Sumerian stories. Genesis comes along and it summarizes those stories. And as soon as you see that parallel, it is like taking the red pill in the Matrix. You can't go back and read it the other way because the other way doesn't make sense anymore. It resolves all the moral problems of God doing bizarre, odd, wicked, anti-human things or making absurd mistakes. Suddenly you realize you're not reading the stories of a double-minded or confused God. You're reading about a community of beings who are bumping up against each other in their aspiration to manage planet Earth. And that is the real reframing that began the story towards escaping from Eden.
In the last year and a half, revelations from the U.S. Navy, the Pentagon, and French intelligence have endorsed the existence of UFOs, or to use the precise forms of the words they used, off-world vehicles not made on this Earth. Almost weekly now, we have news items relating to signs of water on Mars, or atmospheric gases indicating possible life on Venus and other planets. Why is all this, in your opinion, in the news now, and what does the book of Genesis have to do with any of this?
I think what that is part of the drip, drip, drip of disclosure that's happened. In the past, if somebody had come out saying that they had been researching materials from off-world vehicles not made on this Earth, and they'd been doing that for the Pentagon, you would have a government spokesman coming out and denying that story. In the past, when Ed Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, spoke about in his campaign for disclosure because he believed there had been ET contact, NASA met the press and said, Ed Mitchell is a great American, but we don't share his views. Now there has been a really significant shift because since 1947, there was a policy of denial, silence, non-disclosure. It was signed into law in 1947 in the National Security Act. And then there's been this change. So a couple of years ago, we had the Navy could now start talking about engaging with UFOs or UAPs. And then we had Luis Elizondo talking about the unit in the Pentagon. Eric Davis went to the press. Chris Mellon confirmed that story. Alain Juillet of French intelligence confirmed that story. So bit by bit, we are getting official disclosures of engagement with ET technology. But it's sort of bit by bit. And when you see this drip by drip disclosure, what we are really seeing is it's like a blend of cover-up and disclosure. The bits of disclosure show you there's a lot we're not being told, but here's what we have been told. And what does the book of Genesis have to do with that? We actually see exactly the same blend in the Bible because, as I said before, there are stories of ET contact all the way through the Bible from start to finish. But then, sometime around the 6th century BCE, and there's a very broad consensus about this among scholars, there was an edit done on the Hebrew Scriptures to rework them into a single book to teach a single theology, that there is only one God, one source of all things, which is a great message. But to make that message, they tried to airbrush out all the ET narratives. And there is a cover-up in the story of the Bible itself. If you go to the Ten Commandments, they begin with a command not to bow down to any of the other powerful ones. Well, if they didn't exist, you wouldn't have to say that. That belongs to a henotheistic world where you've got a number of powers, but this is the one you're following. And then in Joshua, it repeats where Joshua says, cut yourself off from the powerful ones that our ancestors worshipped and follow only Yahweh. And there are various other points where it really is impossible to airbrush out the ET aspect of what's going on. And so even in the Bible, you've got this blend of what's been forgotten, what's been remembered, what's been covered up, what's been disclosed. And we're in that kind of a period now where I think there is a drip, drip, drip of information. For anyone paying attention, they'll realize there's been a big shift now that official people are actually speaking about engaging with three-dimensional stuff from UFO craft.
Now, as you shared, stories about ET contact go way back in time, but also that phenomena that we experienced here, especially in the United States, really started in the 1940s and the late 1940s, when the policy of silence and debunking came in. Have you found anything in Genesis that would shed light on why that time, the 1940s, was so special, or that time in particular would have prompted so much interest in our planet?
Definitely. The answer to that question is in the first two sentences of the book of Genesis. And I say that because we think of Genesis as the creation story. But I challenge anyone to go back and read it again, because before any of the so-called creation of let there be light and the creation of the sun, the moon, the stars, planet Earth already exists in that story. Before any word of creation has been spoken, planet Earth is there, flooded and shrouded in darkness. And it's to that planet that the Elohim arrive. They arrive in a Ruach, which gets translated as spirit, but is really a craft. And I can talk more about that a little later. Turn up in a craft, and they start rehabilitating the planet. They separate the waters into salt water and fresh water. They separate the lands out so there's places for things to live, and then they nurture life in the oceans, life on the land, and then sentient life, human life. And that story parallels in mythologies all around the world. You can go to Mesoamerica, go to Africa. The stories are the same, that when the Elohim, the powerful ones, turn up, what they're doing is rehabilitating a planet that's been devastated. The Hebrew phrase is tohu wa bohu. It's chaotic and devastated. And they are doing a work of recovery. Now, I mentioned that. It addresses the question because the first close encounter in the Bible is a benevolent one, where these other beings have arrived to help a devastated planet that is hanging in the balance. And I think that's where we were just after the Second World War. We had just released the power of nuclear warfare on our planet. And when you explode an atomic bomb, it will send an atomic signature out into space. And any neighbors would suddenly look at planet Earth and say, what on earth just happened there? And if they're at all interested in us, they would turn up to find out. And I believe that's what happened. That's why there was a sudden flurry of UFO phenomena. I believe beings came to check out what was happening, and some of them came because they wanted to protect us at another moment when our welfare hung in the balance. Something happened more recently that really confirms that idea for me, and that was at the time of the meltdown at Chernobyl, where reactor 4 melted down. This was still in the time of the Soviet Union. The official news agency reported on this, and in Pravda, you can read an account of how near reactor 4 for 6 hours was a UFO hovering, and hundreds of people saw it. And the newspaper suggested it was there in some kind of a restraining capacity to ensure that something far worse didn't happen. Because if reactor 4 really had melted down and exploded, we would have lost a quarter of Europe. And that didn't happen. So I believe that some of the ET presence that's here is here for benevolent reasons to look after us. And that's why there was this sudden spat after Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And there's been many stories of UFOs appearing above U.S. SAC bases, nuclear sites in the United States in the ensuing years.
Yes, there have, and I think it's for the same reason.
You mentioned the word Ruach, Spirit, and the Hebrew term Ruach HaKodesh is the Holy Spirit. Do you say that that's the means of transportation? Please elaborate on that.
Yes, the word Ruach does get used that way later on in the Scriptures, but its first appearance is in Genesis, where the powerful ones appear. I am arguing in Escaping from Eden that it is a craft. And I'm not sticking my neck out by saying that, because Ezekiel describes what a ruach looks like in his book. He describes what it's made of, what the metal looked like, what the glass looked like, the noise it made when it moved, how the wheels operated. And in fact, his descriptions of the ruach in that chapter are so precise that NASA has a patent on what is in the book of Ezekiel. It's called the Omnidirectional Wheel, and they obtained the patent via Joseph Blumrich in, I think it was 1974. And if anyone doubts it, I can send them the patent number. They can look it up. So, look, the Spirit, you can't have a patent on the Holy Spirit. And that's because the word ruach may be used that way in some places, but in its original uses, it describes a craft that creates a strong wind. And Ezekiel tells us what it looks like.
Is that comparable to the Vimana in the Hindu scriptures?
I think it is, because the Ruach appears to be like what we would call a space shuttle. So it could fly in the atmosphere and it can get up to a mothership. And that's exactly how the Vimanas are described. And it's funny you mention that, because the Vimanas in the Vedic texts are totally unapologetic that they are describing a technological thing, a craft. There's heaps of technology in the Bible. We've got communications devices and we've got flying craft. But in our translation traditions, I guess because in the past we didn't have this technology for ourselves, we had no technological grid for what we were reading. We thought we were translating a spiritual book, and so we used spiritual language. The Vedas are differently. They just tell it like it is. It's a craft. This is the noise it makes. This is the fuel they use. This is how fast they can travel. But really, it's the same picture we're being shown.
Let's take that one step further. You had mentioned that Chris Mellon, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush, endorsed physicist Eric Davis, endorsed Luis Elizondo, affirming that the Pentagon's UFO investigation unit had recovered materials from UFOs or off-world vehicles not made on this Earth. What can you tell us about recovered technology? And in your research, have you found off-world technology in the Bible recovered?
Certainly. I think recovered technology is the place to go if you are at all skeptical about the UFO phenomenon. Go because it's absolutely topical, because right now officials and government personnel are talking about exactly this, what's called metamaterials, retrieved materials from UFO crashes. Just in the last 2 years, that's been happening. So Google it, go on YouTube, and you can find this is a real thing with real authoritative people talking about these things. Even before that happened, one of the great advocates for disclosure of contact was Ed Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon. And really, you just watch him. I think a more honorable, courageous man of integrity you could scarcely wish to find. And he believed that if you're skeptical about these things, the thing to study is crash retrievals. Read the books. He used the word lore, short for folklore. Read the books that talk about crash retrievals, and they will talk about three-dimensional, tangible things that were not made on this earth, that were made by another intelligence. As soon as you're looking at that, your universe will change. And once it's changed, and you go back and read the Bible again, you will recognize technology being described all the way through. So many times, the character of Yahweh in the Hebrew Scriptures arrives in a craft that belches smoke and fire, makes a loud noise like a waterfall, shakes the ground when it lands. And there's an amazing sequence in the story of Moses' interaction with Yahweh at the giving of the law, when he's been in conversation with this powerful one for a number of days, and they're talking about how the people of Israel are going to be governed. And at the end of this conversation, Moses says, "Can I see your glory?" Now, that word, kavod, literally means a big, heavy thing. And we're told that Yahweh arrived in a big, noisy, heavy thing at the beginning of this conversation. "Can I see your big, heavy thing?" And Yahweh says, "Well, you can, but you can't be in the open when it moves, otherwise that'll kill you. You'll need to be sheltered in a cleft in the rock, and then I'll let you see it moving away." And what's being described there are safety guidelines for not dying when a big, heavy thing launches and lands. It is so obvious, and the words used are craft, ruach, and kavod, big, heavy thing, and then the story tells you the rest. But as I say, because there were translators working on this who'd never seen a Saturn V rocket or anything like it, when they translated it, it all comes out in this garbled way of you can't see the face of God and live, except for Moses who can, except for when he can't, and then he must be in a cleft in the rock, and then he can only see God's goodness, and then he can only see God's goodness from behind. It, with all due respect, that translation is gibberish, and no one can read it and think that translation has got it right. There is technology in that, and the moment you use the technological translations, it makes perfect sense that Yahweh is protecting Moses from being out in the open when the big heavy thing launches. Absolutely. Just the same as when we launch at Cape Canaveral, the people operating that launch are 3 miles away behind reinforced concrete. It's the same thing.
My guest, Paul Anthony Wallace. We're talking about his book, Escaping from Eden. We'll be back with more of Paul after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Ascending Hearts is no ordinary dating site, but a spiritual dating site with a purpose, to link you with your soulmate. We engineer the serendipity so you can trust that you will attune with someone that has the same matching vibration as you. Ascending Hearts, the conscious dating site for the spiritually aware. Try Ascending Hearts for free. AscendingHearts.com.
Grab a cup of tea or a glass of wine and tune in for Inspired Conversations with publisher Linda Joy on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. Linda creates sacred space for leading female luminaries, empowering authors, heart-centered female entrepreneurs, coaches, and healers. A soulful venue where guests openly share the fears and obstacles they've overcome, wisdom and lessons learned, and the personal journey that led them to the transformational work they do in the world. Inspired Conversations to empower you on your path to authentic, soulful living.
So I'm a cat, and I just moved in with this new human, and she's got this little toy she's always playing with, all day long. Tap, 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 bloop, bloop. She can't put it down. There it is. Oh, and get this. She even talks to it. Last week, she asked it for Chinese, and guess what? Egg rolls showed up. Like magic. Humans have cool toys.
A person is the best thing to happen to a shelter pet. Be that person. Adopt. Brought to you by the Ad Council and the ShelterPetProject.org.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Paul Anthony Wallace. He's the author of Escaping from Eden. Paul, things to do with UFOs or ETs are still in the general public quite taboo. People struggle to take the phenomenon seriously, nowhere more so than in the area of what's been dubbed alien abduction. What have you found in your research that relates to that?
I think you're right. I think that is one of the aspects of ET phenomena that people find the hardest to take seriously. When people say they've been abducted by aliens, you only have to say that and people laugh. It's treated as a joke. I was absolutely blown away just a couple of years ago when Ita Buttrose, the chair of the Australian ABC, did an interview with a lady who claimed she'd been abducted for hybridization, and it was a serious interview. And I was open-mouthed because these subjects have been treated with such ridicule through the years. And I applaud Ita Buttrose for having that conversation, and Jane Pooley, who went on with her report. When we hear stories like that, we act as if we'd never heard the like before. But the moment you start reading ancestral narratives and world mythologies, you realize we have been told the like for thousands of years. I don't think there's a culture in this world that doesn't have an ancient narrative that humans have been abducted for hybridization by another presence on planet Earth. I first heard this in world mythology in the context of Ghana, which is the land of my fathers on my father's side. They have a tradition called the Mamiwata tradition, which talks about people going missing and reappearing 2 or 3 years later, and they'll come back saying they were taken by people who looked human but weren't, and they were taken to an underwater base and they were used for hybridization, and now they've been returned. Not exactly a story that's going to help you be taken seriously or get a job or make a fortune, but this is a story that goes back centuries. Go to East Africa, to Kenya. The Mahurani tradition tells exactly the same story. You can go down to the southernmost tip of South Africa, all up the western seaboard, to the Caribbean, to Brazil, Haiti, Cuba. The same stories are told there. As far east as the Philippines, the same stories are told there. And they have specialized language to tell these stories, which shows how important it's been to their cultures. And then go into Europe, and you've got Scottish, Welsh, Irish traditions telling exactly the same thing. I was blown away when I discovered recently that there was a Presbyterian minister in Scotland who, when he went to his parish, I think it was Aberfoyle, listened to what the locals were telling him. Now, there was a good pastor. Listened to what the locals told him about what had been going on. And he wrote a book called The Secret Commonwealth. And he had it published. It's still in print to this day. And it says, from the Celtic tradition, there is a presence on planet Earth that takes humans and uses them for hybridization. He wrote that in the 1600s. So he was really sticking his neck out. And I found, as I say, go to any culture in the world, listen to their ancestral narratives, and this story of abduction for hybridization emerges. And so the more I've heard, the more I'm wondering, how do more people not know about this? Why is not this the mainstream narrative? Why do we react as if we've never heard such a thing before when the story's been told by cultures all around the world since time immemorial?
The question that comes up in my mind is, why would ETs, who presumably were more advanced than us, possibly want to hybridize and mate with us?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, though, I'd question more advanced. They have more advanced tech, but that doesn't mean that they are in every way better than we are. And there may be things about humans that are really fascinating and uniquely wonderful, that they want to have some of our benefits in their gene pool. It's not hard to believe that there may be something unique about the blend of animal, mammal, and higher consciousness that makes humans a remarkable species. And I think the blend that's unique here has to do with our capacity for love, compassion, creativity. I think that may be attractive to some of our neighbors. But the stories, if you go to the Sumerian stories, the first hybridization happens because our visitors are trying to create a Homo sapiens that's going to be useful to them as a workforce. The same in the Mesoamerican story. They're hybridizing with us so they can have workers. And the phrase in the Popol Vuh, the Mesoamerican story, is let us make avatars for ourselves to do the work and bring us our food. And then go to Genesis 6, and there's a second wave of hybridization when the Bene Elohim, that phrase I think means ones like the powerful ones, or the second wave of powerful ones, come and hybridize. And we're told in Genesis 6 it's because they found human beings beautiful. Maybe for the reasons I've just said, or maybe they found us physically beautiful and wanted that in their gene pool. Go to the Mamiwata stories that I just referenced from Africa and around the world, and it looks like we've got a species that is wanting to enhance their own species with human DNA. And that might be because they're dying out and they need a bigger mix in their gene pool. They might need the robust physicality that human beings have. They might want the emotionality that we have. But in a funny way, maybe we need to take it as a compliment that this narrative of abductions and hybridization is there. We have something that our neighbors want. And there are people who share stories of this kind of engagement that are benevolent other than the fact they've been taken. And then there are other people who have far more harrowing stories. And you were talking the other day to G.L. Davies about experiences of abduction in Wales and Pembrokeshire in his book Harvest. So I think there is a great spectrum of experience, but it's something we should take seriously and not react with ridicule when we hear the word abduction.
Now, a lot of these experiences are from memories retrieved through regression therapy, regression hypnotherapy, or people say their memories are retrieved that way. How reliable is that method?
Well, that's a great question. It was really a method that was championed by the head of clinical psychology for Harvard, John Mack, and he used the method of regression when he had been tasked by U.S. Defense to look into military personnel who had reported close encounters and abduction experiences. And so his method was to put them into a state of deep relaxation, and he did this through controlled conscious breathing, which we mentioned earlier, get the people into a very relaxed state, and then say something like, so it's February the 16th when you saw this thing. Just tell me what you saw. And they'll begin saying, and they'll talk about the thing that was in the report they filed. And then he started asking secondary questions, and he'd say things like this. Just move your head to the left. Tell me what you can see. Just look up now. Tell me what you can see. What are you feeling right now? And it was in those secondary questions that as he looked across his 50 case studies, the answers all correlated. When they turned their head to the left, they all saw the same thing. When they looked above, they saw the same thing. They felt the same temperature. The same phenomena were being described. And so it was through that methodology that he realized that something objective had happened to these experiences. And that was the report he took back to U.S. Defense. Harvard was a bit embarrassed when they heard that was the case. And they wanted to criticize his method, because they were embarrassed by his conclusions. But in the end, they had to back off and say he's in good standing, great standing with Harvard, and we applaud his work, and he's absolutely free to pursue his research. So when somebody of that standing and credibility uses that method and gets that result, it gives us an idea of the credibility of that method of regression therapy to retrieve memory. And I think it is very interesting that some of the hardest evidence comes in that context. It's not that people turn up and tell ridiculous stories and get taken seriously. It's often things they can't remember until they're regressed, and then all these correlations start showing up.
Are we heading for a time of full disclosure, and what will be the impact on both society and faith?
I think we're heading there one drip at a time. I think there's been a really significant change of policy now that we've got people like Eric Davis, Chris Mellon, Luis Elizondo, Alan Juillet talking as they are. That's a really significant policy shift. There is a soft disclosure process underway, but I don't think there's going to be a big moment where, the President of the United States will stand up and say, hey, everyone, we just want to tell you we've been in contact for the last 70 years, thought we should let you know. I don't think they'll do that, because I think the fallout that you ask about, it may be shocking for some people and take some processing in terms of worldview and faith. But I think the real danger is the loss of trust in government that would happen if there was a big disclosure like that. I think we're getting the drip, so that in a generation's time, if it comes out that we're in contact, governments have been in communication, people will say, oh, I think I'd more or less worked that out. And if it's done that way, then you don't have that sudden shock moment of, do we trust our governments? Do we trust our religious authorities? There isn't that same explosive impact to it. So I think that's what's happening.
What would you like readers to take away from Escaping from Eden?
Well, where I got to by the end of Escaping from Eden was a great deal of excitement about who we are and what our potential is. And I say that because of something we haven't really got into, but it flows from the story of how we were engineered, and all the stories curated by cultures around the world that talk about our engineering by an ET species by the way, that's in Plato as well, their story is that we were engineered, upgraded, and then downgraded so we could be more easily managed. All the cultures that have curated that story have also curated shamanic, mystical modalities that are aimed at re-upgrading us, getting us back up to the point where we are more conscious, more intelligent, better able to live, self-heal, engage intelligently as a species on planet Earth. And I came away so hopeful that we can do that these mystical traditions are there precisely because we can operate at a higher level and live more intelligently on this planet and enjoy a better human experience. So that's the conclusion I've reached through probing all these ET narratives in the Bible and Escaping from Eden.
And to that, I will say amen. My guest is Paul Anthony Wallace, his book, Escaping from Eden. Paul, one more time, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you and this work.
Sure. You can get Escaping from Eden from Amazon, Kindle, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold. Go to paulanthonywallace.com, Anthony with an H, Wallace, W-A-L-L-I-S, paulanthonywallace.com. Visit the Paul Wallace channel on YouTube and the Fifth Kind TV. We have a website. You can find us on YouTube. You can follow our content, our documentaries, and everything that's happening with Escaping from Eden.
Paul, thank you so much for sharing this fascinating information.
Victor, thank you so much for having me on the show, and I look forward to next time.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.